My boyfriend took me to meet his coworkers at Hooters, and what happened there made me realize I was dating a stranger. What they put me through that night was so humiliating, so degrading, that I'm still questioning everything I thought I knew about love and respect. My name is Sarah. I'm 25 years old, and this is the story of how one dinner destroyed my relationship and nearly broke my spirit. I met Jake 2 years ago at a coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my engineering degree. He was 29, confident, and seemed genuinely interested in my passion for automation engineering. We bonded over shared hobbies that most people considered unconventional for women, things like building computers, gaming, and discussing the latest tech innovations. Jake seemed proud to have found someone who could keep up with his interests, someone who wasn't just pretending to like these things to impress him. Those early days felt magical. We'd spend hours talking about everything from the latest video game releases to complex engineering problems I was tackling in school. He'd introduce me to his friends as his brilliant girlfriend who actually knows more about computers than most guys. I felt seen, appreciated, valued for my mind and my genuine interests. For the first year and a half, everything seemed perfect. Jake was supportive when I landed my first job as a junior automation engineer, celebrating my small victories and encouraging me through the steep learning curve that comes with any new career. We talked about our future together, about how we'd build something meaningful as a team. He seemed to understand that being a junior engineer meant I was still learning, still growing into my role. When I'd come home frustrated about not knowing how to solve a particular problem, he'd remind me that everyone starts somewhere. I thought I'd found my person, someone who saw my potential and loved me for exactly who I was. But looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I chose to ignore. There were subtle comments that made me uncomfortable, little jokes that felt more like tests than genuine humor. Jake would sometimes make remarks about how his coworkers didn't believe he was dating someone who was actually into guy stuff, and not just pretending. When I'd ask what he meant by that, he'd brush it off with a laugh, saying it was just guy talk and that I was being too sensitive. There were moments when I felt like I was being evaluated rather than appreciated, like I had to prove my worth in conversations about my hobbies or my work. But I rationalized these feelings away, telling myself that Jake was just proud to have a girlfriend who shared his interests and that his friends were probably just curious about me. The red flags became harder to ignore when Jake started talking about introducing me to his work friends. He'd mention how they were skeptical about his claims of dating a hot engineer who actually plays video games, and how he couldn't wait to show me off to them. The way he phrased it always made me feel like an object to be displayed rather than a person to be introduced. When I'd express discomfort with being described as something to show off, Jake would accuse me of being dramatic and remind me that he was just excited about our relationship. He'd say things like, "Most guys would kill to have a girlfriend like you. I'm just proud." But the pride felt possessive, like I was a trophy rather than a partner. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late March. Jake had been building up to this dinner for weeks, talking about how his coworkers were dying to meet me and how it would be fun to finally put their doubts to rest. He chose Hooters as the venue, claiming it was the most convenient location since it was close to their office. When I expressed discomfort with the choice, pointing out that there were plenty of other restaurants in the area, Jake dismissed my concerns. "It's just a restaurant, Sarah. Don't make it weird," he said, making me feel like I was being unreasonable for having an opinion about where we ate. I should have trusted my instincts then, but I wanted to support Jake and meet the people he worked with every day. The moment we walked into Hooters, I felt the uncomfortable energy that would define the entire evening. Jake's 4 coworkers were already seated at a large table, and their eyes immediately began evaluating me from head to toe. There was Marcus, the loud one who seemed to be the unofficial leader of their group. David, who had a smirk that never left his face. Tony, who barely made eye contact but kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. And Chris, who seemed the most normal of the bunch but would prove to be just as problematic as the others. They all appeared to be in their early 30s, and they carried themselves with the kind of confidence that comes from never having their opinions challenged. "So you're the famous Sarah," Marcus said as we sat down, his tone already setting the stage for what was to come. "Jake's told us so much about you. We've been dying to meet this mysterious girlfriend who supposedly shares all his hobbies." The word "supposedly" hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized this wasn't going to be a normal dinner with new acquaintances. Jake laughed nervously beside me, and I caught him exchanging a look with Marcus that made me feel like I was missing some inside joke. The conversation started innocuously enough, with the usual small talk about work and the weather, but I could sense something brewing beneath the surface, a tension that felt deliberate and calculated. The waitress, a young woman who couldn't have been older than 21, approached our table with a bright smile. Immediately, the men began making comments about her appearance that made me cringe. "Now that's what I call service," David said with a laugh, and the others joined in with equally uncomfortable observations. I looked at Jake, expecting him to show some sign of disapproval, but he just smiled along with them like this was perfectly normal behavior. As the evening progressed, the conversation began to shift in a direction that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of getting to know me as a person, Jake's coworkers began what felt like an interrogation designed to test my authenticity. "So Jake tells us you're into gaming," Marcus said, leaning forward with the intensity of a prosecutor. "What did you think of the latest update to Call of Duty?" When I admitted I hadn't played that particular game, I could see the smug satisfaction in his eyes. "Interesting. What about the new graphics card releases? Which one do you think offers the best price-to-performance ratio?" The questions kept coming, each one more specific and technical than the last. They weren't interested in having a conversation about shared interests. They were trying to catch me in a lie, to prove that I was some kind of fraud who was pretending to be into these things to impress Jake. When I'd answer honestly that I wasn't familiar with every obscure detail they brought up, they'd exchange meaningful glances as if they'd uncovered some great deception. "It's okay," Tony said with false reassurance. "Not everyone can keep up with all the latest developments. It takes real dedication." The interrogation extended to my professional life as well. When they learned I was a junior automation engineer, the questions became even more pointed and condescending. "So you're still learning the ropes," Chris said, not really asking but stating it like a fact that diminished my credibility. "Let me ask you about servo motor control systems. How would you approach optimizing the response time for a multi-axis application?" The question was clearly beyond the scope of what a junior engineer would typically handle, and they knew it. When I explained that I was still learning about advanced control systems, Marcus laughed and said, "Well, we all start somewhere, right?" Throughout this entire ordeal, I kept looking to Jake for support, for some sign that he recognized how inappropriate his friends were being. But instead of defending me or redirecting the conversation, he actively participated in what felt like a hazing ritual. "Come on, Sarah," he said when I started giving shorter, less enthusiastic responses. "Don't be shy. Show them what you know." He was treating me like a performing animal, expected to dance for their entertainment and approval. The man I thought I knew, the man who claimed to love and respect me, was feeding me to the wolves for his own social standing. As the evening wore on, I found myself withdrawing emotionally. I stopped trying to engage with their questions, stopped pretending to smile at their jokes, and started responding with simple, factual answers. This only seemed to irritate them more. "You seem a little tense," David observed, as if my discomfort was unreasonable given the circumstances. "We're just trying to get to know you better. No need to be so serious about everything." Jake, rather than recognizing that his friends were being inappropriate, turned his frustration on me. "Sarah, what's wrong with you tonight?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of embarrassment that cut through me like a knife. "You're being really standoffish. These guys are trying to include you, and you're just sitting there with an attitude." An attitude, as if having a normal human reaction to being disrespected and tested was somehow unreasonable, as if I was the problem for not enjoying being treated like a curiosity rather than a person. "I'm just tired," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but Jake wasn't satisfied with that answer. "You were fine earlier. Did someone say something to upset you?" The question might have seemed caring to an outside observer, but I could hear the underlying message: fix your attitude and play along. His friends were watching this exchange with interest, clearly enjoying the dynamic they'd created. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just being tested by his coworkers, I was being tested by Jake himself, and I was failing some criteria I hadn't even known existed. The final straw came when Marcus decided to share his opinion about women in engineering. "It's great that more women are getting into technical fields," he said with the kind of patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "Of course, it's important that they're actually qualified and not just diversity hires. The field needs to maintain its standards." The implication was clear, and the fact that he felt comfortable saying this to my face in front of my boyfriend showed just how little respect any of them had for me. Jake's response to this comment was perhaps the most devastating moment of the entire evening. Instead of challenging Marcus or defending my qualifications, he actually nodded along. "Sarah's definitely qualified," he said, as if that was some kind of bold statement. "She works really hard to keep up with the technical requirements." Keep up. As if I was struggling to meet some minimum standard rather than learning and growing in my chosen field like every other junior engineer in the world. I sat there in stunned silence, realizing that the man I'd been planning a future with saw me the same way his horrible friends did, as someone who needed to prove herself worthy of their respect, someone whose intelligence and capabilities were always going to be questioned. The conversation continued around me, but I felt like I was watching it from outside my body, disconnected from the humiliation that was happening to me. When Jake suggested we order dessert, I knew I had to get out of there. "I need to use the restroom," I said, standing up from the table. In the bathroom, I stared at myself in the mirror and tried to process what had just happened. I'd been treated like a sideshow attraction, a curiosity to be examined and judged. The man I loved had not only allowed it to happen, but had actively participated in my humiliation. I felt sick to my stomach. Not from the food, but from the realization that I'd been living a lie for 2 years. When I returned to the table, the men were laughing about something, and I could tell from their expressions that they'd been talking about me. "Everything okay?" Jake asked, but there was no genuine concern in his voice. He was still playing to his audience, still more concerned with how he appeared to his friends than with how I was feeling. I nodded and sat back down, but I was done participating in whatever this was supposed to be. The ride home was tense and silent. Jake kept glancing at me, clearly frustrated with my behavior, but trying to figure out how to address it. Finally, he spoke up. "What was that about tonight? You were really rude to my friends." Rude. I'd been subjected to an evening of condescension and testing, and I was the one who had been rude. "They were just trying to get to know you, and you acted like they were attacking you or something." I turned to look at him. This man I'd shared my bed with for 2 years, and I barely recognized him. "They weren't trying to get to know me, Jake. They were trying to prove that I was lying about my interests and my qualifications, and you helped them do it." He immediately got defensive, claiming that I was being overly sensitive and that his friends were just being guys. "That's how men bond," he said, as if that explained or excused their behavior. "They were testing you because they care about me and want to make sure you're good enough for me." Good enough for him. The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't someone to be evaluated for worthiness. I was supposed to be his partner, his equal, someone he respected and valued. But clearly, that's not how he saw me at all. I was an accessory that needed to pass inspection, a trophy that had to meet certain standards before it could be displayed with pride. That night, I lay in bed next to Jake, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the evening. I thought about all the times I'd dismissed my own discomfort, all the times I'd rationalized his behavior or convinced myself that I was being too sensitive. I thought about the future we'd planned together and realized that it was built on a foundation of inequality and disrespect that I'd been too blind to see. In the days that followed, Jake tried to act like nothing had happened. He sent me texts about his day, made plans for the weekend, and seemed genuinely confused when I didn't respond with my usual enthusiasm. When he finally confronted me about my distance, I tried to explain how the dinner had made me feel. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be," he said, using the same dismissive tone he'd used countless times before. "My friends like you. They were just being thorough because they care about me." But I was done being told how to feel about my own experiences. I was done being gaslit into believing that my reactions were unreasonable when I was being treated with blatant disrespect. I was done being with someone who saw me as an object to be evaluated rather than a person to be loved. The dinner at Hooters had been a revelation, showing me exactly where I stood in Jake's life and how little he actually valued me as an individual. The breakup conversation happened on a Saturday morning over coffee in my apartment. Jake was still trying to convince me that I was overreacting, that his friend's behavior was normal, and that I needed to learn to take a joke. But I wasn't laughing anymore. I wasn't smiling and pretending everything was fine. I was finally speaking up for myself in a way I should have done years ago. "I don't want to be with someone who thinks I need to prove my worth to his friends," I told him, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "I don't want to be with someone who participates in my humiliation and then tells me I'm being too sensitive. I deserve better than that." Jake's face cycled through confusion, anger, and finally a kind of desperate pleading as he realized I was serious. "Sarah, please don't do this. We can work through this. I'll talk to the guys. Make sure they understand that you're off limits for that kind of thing." But he still didn't get it. He still thought the problem was his friend's behavior, not his own. He still thought I was an object that needed protection, rather than a person who deserved basic respect. After Jake left that morning, I sat in my apartment and cried for the relationship I thought I'd had, for the future I thought we'd been building together. But underneath the sadness was something else, a sense of relief that I'd finally stood up for myself, that I'd finally said enough. The dinner at Hooters had been humiliating and degrading, but it had also been clarifying. It had shown me exactly what I was worth to the man I'd planned to spend my life with, and it had given me the strength to demand better. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my confidence and remembering who I was outside of that relationship. I threw myself into my work, connecting with other engineers who respected my contributions and supported my growth. I reconnected with friends who valued me for who I was, not who they thought I should be. Slowly, I began to remember that I didn't need anyone's approval or validation to be worthy of love and respect. The experience taught me that love without respect is just manipulation dressed up in pretty words. It taught me that someone who truly cares about you will never put you in a position where you have to prove your worth to others. It taught me that I have the right to be treated with dignity in all circumstances, and that anyone who can't provide that basic courtesy doesn't deserve a place in my life. Jake tried to contact me several times in the months that followed, sometimes apologizing, sometimes trying to convince me that I'd misunderstood what had happened, but I never responded. I'd said everything I needed to say, and I'd heard everything I needed to hear. The man who took me to Hooters that night showed me exactly who he was, and I finally had the courage to believe him. Today, I'm stronger, more confident, and more certain of my worth than I've ever been. I'm building a career that fulfills me, surrounded by people who respect and support me. I'm no longer willing to accept less than I deserve, and I'm no longer afraid to walk away from situations that don't serve me. The dinner that was supposed to humiliate me ended up liberating me, and for that, I'm grateful. If you're in a relationship where you constantly feel like you need to prove yourself, where your partner allows others to disrespect you, where you're made to feel like you're the problem for having normal human reactions to inappropriate behavior, please know that you deserve better. You deserve someone who stands up for you, who values you, who sees you as an equal partner rather than an accessory. Don't let anyone convince you that your standards are too high or that you're being too sensitive. Trust your instincts, speak up for yourself, and never settle for less than the respect and love you deserve. That night at Hooters changed everything for me. It ended a relationship I thought was forever, but it also gave me back my self-respect and my voice. And that trade, as painful as it was worth every moment of discomfort I endured to get here.